The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. Hope you're all well. We've got a great episode coming up today with Knowde Group, who are talking about clinical trials in the cannabis space. They're a very high quality team, so I hope you enjoy it. They're also actually putting on a virtual and in-person conference in October called the Psychedelic and Cannabis Research Summit. That's taking place October 7th to 9th. And if you're in or near the Toronto area, it'll be in person on the 9th of October. So if this podcast episode is relevant to you, I highly recommend attending that conference. I'll provide links and details on my LinkedIn posts for this week's episode, so please check them out. I've also got the Global Go webinar coming up tomorrow, Tuesday, 21st of September. As a quick reminder, I plugged this last week. I put a webinar together for Global Go next week on what's happening in the UK. Global Go are a North American cannabis consultancy that I represent in the UK. We have Professor David Nutt, who'll be giving the keynote talk on Project 2021. And then I'll be chairing a panel to give an overview of the medical cannabis landscape in the UK. Joining me will be Dr. Anne-Catherine Schlag from Drug Science, Nick Patiras from Materia, Ed McDermott from Seed Innovations and EMAC Life Sciences, and Harry Gugliani from Columbia Care. So that's happening Tuesday, 21st of September at 6 p.m. UK, which I think is 10 a.m. Pacific. Please join. Again, details will be on the LinkedIn page, so please register there. On with the show. Enjoy. On today's show, I have Jaspreet Grewal and Sabrina Ramkellawan, who are founders of Knowde Group. Knowde Group are a contract research organization and consultancy specialising in plant-based therapeutics and psychedelics. Jaspreet and Sabrina, welcome. How are you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having us today.
Thank you, Anuj. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no, real pleasure. Real pleasure. Where are you in the world today?
I'm based in Calgary, Canada, and Sabrina is in Toronto.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you for joining us. Lots to talk about today. We're going to be talking about clinical trials and how they work in cannabis. But as is customary, let's start with a bit about both of you. What were you doing before and what sort of prompted you to start focusing on cannabis and why? Maybe we'll start with you, Jaspreet.
Sounds great. So I am a clinician by background, have always worked in clinical trials and regulatory affairs. My background is specifically in ophthalmology, so very different from cannabis, but the foundations of my medical background as well as my work in clinical trials and regulatory really helped lay the foundation for working in cannabis. I started working in the cannabis industry in 2018 when it was just legalized here in Canada. And my work started with performing more due diligence for law firms and financial institutions to assist with claims verification. And from there, I started to move into more clinical work and regulatory work and received an academic position with the University of Calgary, becoming their first medical cannabis expert advisor or entrepreneur in residence with their tech transfer hub on campus. I now have a number of clients globally working in a business development and regulatory capacity, and that led us to forming Knowde in early 2020. And I'll pass it on to Sabrina to go through her background next.
Oh, Jaspreet, just before you do that, what was the kind of reason for getting involved in cannabis, and did you have any reservations about that choice? And it's obviously a lot of stigma involved with the plant.
Of course. Well, I personally didn't have any experience with the plant in both a personal or even a professional capacity. And I got brought into the industry at the request of a now colleague and mentor of mine, who is a director of the Canadian Securities Exchange. I just happened to have met him at a finance meeting in Calgary in November 2018. He saw my background, understood my work in regulatory and the decade of experience I've already had working in that capacity, and asked me to assist with companies. And I ended up in Toronto for about 2 months working with a number of different firms And, in terms of stigma, I viewed it as a lens of any other therapeutic that I was evaluating. It could be cannabis, it could have been psychedelics, it could have been a new cardiology medication. It's, for me, it's looking at the therapeutic and looking at what the guidances tell us.
Very good. Very objective. I like that. Sabrina, how about you? Would you tell us a bit about your background and the reasons why you got into cannabis?
Yeah, sure. So I started my career as a registered nurse with a critical care background. So I had a chance to work as a nurse in ICU emerge, mental health, pediatrics, and community nursing. So did that for a while and then kind of fell into research, started in the hospital and fell in love with it. That's all I wanted to do after that. I've also worked on the pharmaceutical company side for more than 8 years and also had a chance to run operations at small contract research organizations as well as large ones. The large one was INC Research, which is now Syneos. It's a global CRO. So really got a chance to work on all sides of research and pretty much all the positions that there are out there in terms of coordinating studies, monitoring them, and running kind of operations. So just a lot of experience running clinical trials. So I kind of fell into cannabis just by kind of chance, I guess. I was an independent consultant, had my own company. So I was helping pharmaceutical companies and research sites already conduct clinical trials. And this was the time that medical cannabis just got approved. And I got contacted for a contract to help build a cannabis clinic in the early days. And I had already had experience building sleep clinics and pain clinics. So, went ahead and did that contract. And that's kind of where I was a little nervous because I didn't, as a nurse, even, as a medical professional, you're not taught anything about cannabis. So I was a little apprehensive about building a clinic and, building education with cannabis and trying to figure out treatment protocols and things like that was something I didn't understand. But I guess I self-taught myself very quickly when you have to build a cannabis clinic. So did that, learned a lot and was really surprised about how patients, did well with cannabis. So as a nurse, I was never really thanked a lot and hugged and thank you, changed my life. But it was really strange that was happening in cannabis. So it was really interesting for me as a nurse, kind of from that perspective. So that's kind of how I found nursing. And because I built a cannabis clinic that was Canada-wide with doctors across Canada, we were getting a lot of attentions from the licensed producers in Canada. So I ended up starting to work with different licensed producers, helping them early on with research and clinical trials. And that's kind of how I started in the space.
Fantastic. And did you have any funny looks or stigma from friends or colleagues, family?
Well, definitely in the beginning, because I was working in kind of the clinical trial space. In the early days, people thought it was strange that I decided to focus my research on cannabis. I mean, now everybody wants to get into it, but in the beginning, it was like, and there's a lot of medical people that were really apprehensive when I would call them to help us conduct a clinical trial, let's say PTSD and cannabis. They're used to me calling them when I worked on the research side with pharma trials. So again, I was getting that reluctancy in the early days, but I think that's changed quite a bit, because it's been legalized for a while, but definitely some concerns and people were, wondering what I was doing with my career.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for sharing that. That's really interesting and it leads up quite nicely to what we're going to talk about. But let's maybe talk a bit about Knowde, and you guys started that at the beginning of last year. Tell us a bit about the story behind Knowde and what exactly you do and how and why you set it up.
Certainly. So early 2020, I called Sabrina out of the blue, literally out of the blue. She and I had the good fortune of meeting and working together on a few opportunities in the cannabis sector, but we weren't colleagues in the sense that we were working on files together. We had similar contracts and clients. And I knew that during my time in 2019 working on cannabis, I wanted to eventually get back to the clinical side. And there was definitely a gap in the industry for addressing clinical trials. A lot of the licensed producers were halting medical activities or focusing more so on recreational projects and their businesses. And so fewer and fewer trials were happening or they were being canceled altogether in Canada. And I rang Sabrina up and I said, I have this crazy idea. I'd like to start a CRO with you. And we were both, for the most part, doing the same thing. We had a lot of independent clients that we were consulting for. And it was just a really synergistic opportunity to get together. And I'm really glad she said yes.
Fantastic. And maybe Maybe Sabrina, do you want to tell us about some of the types of projects that you're working on and that you're looking to work on?
Yeah, I mean, when Jaspreet and I got together, we were kind of already individually working with cannabis clients and also starting to work with psychedelic companies as well. So I wouldn't say we were a startup. We were more of a scale up when we got together. And we both identified that there was a big need and a gap with cannabis companies trying to do clinical trials because they were not set up like pharma companies. Pharma companies are set up and they have internal resources to help with regulatory, to roadmap what their clinical trial program will look like. And cannabis companies, and we're seeing this with psychedelic companies, they just don't have that internally. So after a number of years working with LPs and also Jaspreet working on her end, we recognized that there was a need to handhold and help with clinical trials if we were going to see more clinical trials happen with cannabis products. In terms of projects that we're working with, we have a couple of partnerships that we're really excited about. We are working with the LVV, which is Legion Veterans Village, and it's a $312 million project in Surrey, BC, British Columbia, here in Canada. And they're striving to be a center of excellence for veterans and first responders, focusing on PTSD and mental health. And we're really excited because what we're doing is we're developing a steering committee and really helping to build a framework for cannabis and psychedelic trials focused on first responders and veterans. So we're really excited to have that collaboration. And actually today there's going to be a press release coming out that we have a strategic partnership with a LMC Mana Research. And they are a number of research sites that are driven by different physicians with different specialties across Canada. And we would have access to 1 million patient database. They are also globally as well with access. They're across 5 countries and with access to 15 million patients across the globe. So we're very excited about that because it's really important for us. So we are a decentralized contract research organization, meaning that we don't have a site. And I think that was kind of great that we started right before the pandemic because we've decided not to kind of have sites, but work with sites to conduct clinical trials. So we're really excited about that partnership. It really helps leverage us to do clinical trials across Canada and the globe with this clinic partnership. And they have extensive experience in clinical trials. They have a very diverse population, which is a gap in research as well in terms of the diversity of populations. So we're really excited about that partnership.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for sharing that and congratulations on that new partnership. I'm sure that's going to be very successful. Cool. Okay. Well, look, you mentioned CRO, which is a contract research organization, but why don't we talk about actually a bit of 101 on clinical trials and how they work? Maybe Sabrina, actually, do you want to do the kind of overview at the top? So how do clinical trials work in general, and are there different types of clinical trials?
Sure. So I know we're going to talk about real world evidence as well. So maybe we'll start with more clinical trials then.
Sure.
So clinical trials is done. And for anybody that has anything in their medicine cabinet, whether it's a diabetes drug or antidepressant or anything, it had to go through clinical trials in order for it to get into that medicine cabinet, for it to have a DIN number and for people to go to their pharmacies and buy that medication. So how clinical trials work, a company, and whether biotech pharma company, will go through kind of drug discovery, drug development, and they decide on a particular product and they decide on what that product does. So is it targeting? Is it for the indication of depression? Is it for the indication of PTSD? So it's a focused medication for a specific indication. And what they do have to do first is preclinical trials. So that's kind of in the lab to see if it works, and also animal testing as well. So we're not as involved in that part. We're more involved in kind of the human trials. So when a new drug goes through a clinical trial, it goes through phase 1 to 3 before you can go ahead and submit it for regulatory approval in the jurisdiction that you want it approved. So in Canada, it's Health Canada. In the US, it's FDA. Europe has its own regulatory. So depending, what the regulatory country is that you're trying to get the drug approved. So phase 1 is the first study in humans. And that's where you have a small number of patients. It could be patients or it could be healthy adults. And you're really just assessing safety. Some of the studies look at something called pharmacokinetics. So you're really trying to understand how the drug works. So pharmacokinetics is basically where you're giving people the medication and you're taking a bunch of blood samples to see how much of the drug ends up in their bloodstream, which helps you with when does that drug peak? When does that drug eliminate? understanding of how that drug works in humans. And that helps later on to set the framework of, when you get a medication and it tells you have it with meals, have it fasting, have it twice a day, 3 times a day. And that's kind of some of the stuff that you learn in your phase 1 study. And some studies give the medication fasted, some give it with a high fat breakfast. So this is how some of that stuff is determined. So that's your phase 1. Phase 2, you kind of have you've gone through your phase 1, you realize that it's safe. This has to be submitted. You have to get approved to kind of go into phase 2. So your regulatory bodies will approve your phase 2 based on your phase 1 data. Phase 2, you can get more into patient populations. And now you're also looking for efficacy. So you're saying, does it actually do what it's supposed to do? And that's where you have validated scores. So if it's depression, is it decreasing, depression scores? If it's PTSD, is it improving? So you're monitoring data to see if there's improvement in that indication or condition. And you're also always looking at safety. So you're looking at things called adverse events, which are like side effects, and you're documenting that. So that's kind of what happens in your phase 2. And within phase 1, 2, you're also understanding dosing as well. Sometimes you do things called dose escalation, where you start at a small dose, you kind of see how everyone does. There's a safety committee meeting that says, yes, you can progress to the next level of dosing. And that also helps to figure out what is the max dosing that's tolerable. And also people improve with that dosing without all the side effects. And so that's kind of some of the stuff that you learn. Once you realize that it actually does work in phase 2 and the safety is good and everything's all good, that's when you're ready for a very large scale study. So you're looking at, it could be hundreds, it could be thousands. And typically your phase 3 then is, can you replicate what happened in a small population in phase 2, patient population, into a large scale? And that's really kind of your last test to see if that drug works on a large scale with a lot of people. There's still safety, there's a good safety profile still, and there's efficacy with that drug. Once that's done, then you can go ahead and submit to the regulatory bodies to get that drug approved. Later on, there's a phase 4 that's post-market. So keep in mind, when you do phase 1 to 3, you're not assessing long-term effects. So what happens is that drug gets approved in the world, people are taking it, and now you're still doing post-market assessment, more long-term, you're assessing safety after it's gone to market. And that's kind of your more long-term data. So that's kind of clinical trials in a nutshell.
Yes, wow, brilliant and great overview. And how long do these things take generally?
A lot of it depends on how difficult it is to recruit the patients. So whenever we write a protocol, so the protocol is like a detailed recipe of exactly how that study should be conducted. And it's a pretty thorough kind of protocol. And they have something called inclusion exclusion, which is basically what are all the check boxes for someone to fit into the study? And the more check boxes there are, the harder it is to get someone in the study. So a lot of it depends on that. Your phase 1s don't usually take that long. If you're doing a healthy or very small population, they're very controlled and short. So that could be months if it's not a hard study to recruit, right? If it's not a specific patient population. Phase 2 is a little bit of a larger population, but also again, typically you could do that, I would say a year on average, again, depending on how complicated the patient population is to recruit and the number of patients that are needed. And that's where a stats person would assess how many participants you need so that you can get that it's worthwhile in terms of the statistical analysis. There's enough power. It's powered enough to get good data. Phase 3 could take years, like many, many years. So because it is large scale and typically global studies. So the whole process, well, what would you say, Jaspreet, from beginning to end? Like 25 years, maybe?
Hopefully more like 5 to 7 typically to get to the lifetime. But again, that's where changes in clinical trial designs and being more dynamic assist with accelerating clinical trials these days.
I think that with COVID, I think that the research world has learned how to fast track clinical trials very well. So hopefully those lessons with the COVID trials and how fast we've been able to move it can translate into some of the other types of clinical trials.
Yeah, I hope so. And it's interesting that it's something as not simple, but as something as basic as actually just finding people to test this out on is the difficult. We've had a couple of other guests on the show that said, typically to get a drug to market can cost something between $800 and $1 billion. Where does all that cost go into? Is it because you're just paying experts for time along a long period of time?
Yeah, so when we talk about study budgets, clinical trials certainly do cost a lot of money. It's a breakdown of a budget goes to the site. Your regulatory applications are usually very expensive. That's the easy part financially. It then comes down to cost per patient or participant and how detailed your study is. So if you require a lot of lab visits, if it's very detailed in terms of any additional imaging, so things like MRIs or CT scans, how many blood draws there are, what is the medication dosage and storage as well. So, where is the medication coming from? How you intend to deliver the study drug. Even if it's a placebo study, if you need a placebo drug manufactured specifically for your clinical trial, that can also increase your cost. And then there are, of course, administrative costs that go along with it. So, with the number of participants, you do need monitors who come on behalf of the sponsor to check on the study to ensure it's being conducted properly, to review the data that's coming through. And then, of course, you have your team behind it who are project managing it, reviewing the data, the statistical analysis that has to happen, your safety monitoring committees, the physicians or the principal investigators who conduct the study and their teams. So it is a very detailed budget and process, but if you've done clinical trials for a while, you can certainly figure out how to make your trials more efficient and cost effective. And to Sabrina's point, COVID has really forced the issue that clinical trials have been very cumbersome and labor intensive and cost intensive. So how can we improve it to make it more desirable to continue down that pathway?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that makes sense. And just before we start drilling down on plant medicine and cannabis in particular, we hear the terms randomized controlled test and double-blind placebo. Can you just explain what those are and how they fit into the picture?
Sure. So when we talk about things like, and I'm going to actually add in one more acronym in here. I know that in cannabis we talk about a lot about real world evidence as well. So a randomized control trial is essentially a highly controlled clinical trial, whereas real world data refers to data collected from diversified areas of daily life, and they're outside of the scope of a controlled trial. So typically, and again, I say this because in cannabis we do see a lot of RWE or real world data studies coming up. Usually, say in Health Canada or the FDA, look to real world data to monitor post market safety. So, if you recall, Sabrina was talking about phase 4 clinical trials, which are post market and they assess a long term efficacy of a drug. It's typically where you get the real world data coming in. So, you monitor post market safety and adverse events to make more so regulatory decisions. Healthcare communities like clinician groups use it to support coverage decisions from an insurance standpoint, as well as developing guidelines and decision support tools. And usually they are supported or are used to support clinical trial decisions moving forward. So now we can see that most companies or clinics will do a real world evidence or data study to sample large populations to then eventually turn into controlled clinical trials, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. And so just for the sake of definition, so a randomized clinical trial is just it's a process of assigning rather patients by chance to groups that receive different treatment. And then you have different investigational arms. So one could be getting the actual investigational product. You could have a placebo controlled arm and vice versa. So it just depends on how you want to define your study, what you're intending to investigate, if there's patient populations or cohorts you could develop out of there as well. And again, to what Sabrina was emphasizing, a lot of this is focused on the statistical significance that you hope to achieve and the power that you hope to gain out of the study as well.
One of the big things with a controlled trial is that, with real world evidence, that patient could be taking a lot of other medications, could be also maybe they just started some therapy at the same time. So a lot of times you don't really know when you get scores if it's, let's say, cannabis or something else. With a controlled clinical trial, and I'll give an example of one I did, which was a phase 1, the patient would either get randomized to a high dose THC, a low dose THC, or a placebo. And they don't know. They all of these look the same. And they're not on any other medications, no other treatments. So when you're looking at kind of assessing those patients, you don't have any other factors of, well, it could have been, let's say it was pain. Let's say that their pain scores were improved. It's not because of an opiate they're also taking. It's not because they just started therapy. It's not because now they started yoga and they're more relaxed now, or they started an anti-anxiety medication or anything else. It's very controlled, and they're randomized by chance to get either the low dose THC, the high dose, or the placebo.
Fantastic.
And
Great.
then comparing those results to, is it the low or high dose THC, or is it placebo? And are there any changes in what we're seeing?
Got it. So you can drill down on what you think is working and what's not. Okay, cool. Thank you. So let's move on to the focus, I suppose, which is cannabis. How do clinical trials work with plant medicine and in particular cannabis? I mean, we've obviously covered on the show a few times how traditional pharma is very much focused on a single compound. How does that work with something as complex as cannabis?
I'll actually pass this over to Sabrina because she's have a lot of experience running cannabis clinical trials in Canada already.
Sure.
I wasn't sure if you're going to answer. Okay. So I think a lot of the challenges with cannabis studies is that we're working with companies that are not pharma, right? For me, I found that was the biggest challenge. And also just trying to help them understand what's required for a clinical trial. A lot of it too is there's challenges with the regulatory piece of it. And a lot of it is, I hear this all the time with cannabis companies. I don't understand. I'm already selling the product. Why can't I just do a clinical trial? Why do I need all these approvals? But keep in mind, even though people are selling cannabis, like I'm speaking about Canada and obviously other countries where there's legalization, those products haven't gone through a clinical trial. So it doesn't matter that's being sold and people are already buying it and consuming it. Once it goes through a clinical trial, it's considered an investigational product. And at that point, there's no proof, I guess, or evidence that it has therapeutic value. And so that's kind of where I usually have to try to explain to kind of a company that it's still investigational, regardless if they're selling it to patients and consumers already. So there is challenges with the regulatory. In Canada here, you also have to have a license to conduct the study. And you also need to have certain procedures in place and a place to store a cannabis product as well. So there's a lot of those types of things. And also too, when you do clinical trials, you need to have a standardized product. And a lot of times you do need to have it under GMP as well, good manufacturing practices. So some of those roadblocks are there where companies have to kind of invest to have their product kind of ready, clinical trial ready, I would say. And they would even need to have consistency within the batch that goes into a clinical trial. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that has to happen. They need to have a certain amount of testing on their product, which is above and beyond what they have when they just sell it in the adult use or recreational use space. So there's that testing, the certificate of analysis that shows details about their actual product. So there's a lot of that extra stuff. They have to have documentation about their product and any testing that they've done, and obviously protocol development. And a lot of times they need to know where they want to focus their research too, because sometimes they get excited, cannabis is being used for a lot of things, from mental health things, from anxiety. People are using it for PTSD, chronic pain, and sometimes they have to zero in on where they want to focus. So there's a lot more hand-holding and discussion to kind of figure out how to focus. Sometimes they have a number of products and they don't know even which one to focus on for a particular clinical trial. So there's a lot of that back-end stuff as well with working with companies that have cannabis products that they want to put through to clinical trials. And it's hard for them to focus on that because a lot of times companies are no longer focusing on the medical because it's just easier to just put it out there into the market and sell it as a recreational adult use product.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot there, isn't there? And so, that sort of covers a lot of the practical difficulties. Are there any kind of inherent difficulties of a complex multi-compound substance and how you examine that? So, for example, you said batch consistency, etc. With something that has sort of inherent variability, how do you kind of overcome those sort of aspects?
So maybe I'll just jump in here for a moment as well. One of the other practical considerations that lends itself to this new question is most jurisdictions and regulatory bodies require preclinical data as well. So, for example, Health Canada, including as well as the MHRA, do require that your product has preclinical data assigned to it and that is grown under GMP. That preclinical data is essential to showing the basics of the drug, the compounds, to your point, and the stability of the drug. So that data, as well as vetted analytical data before you bring it to the regulator, is extremely important. If we focus on the United Kingdom specifically, the MHRA does require things called IMPDs, or investigational medicinal product dossiers. And so those have to be written specifically for the drug that you are importing, be it, again, a cardiology drug or a cannabis drug. They have to be provided. And so that is a major roadblock because a lot of companies have not put forth the effort to do that, nor do they have preclinical data. Very small companies do, but it is there. In terms of the study design for products such as cannabis that have a number of compounds, it's a work in progress. We can't exclude one compound or the other. Companies may provide that to us and say, listen, this is what our product looks like. We want to focus on this patient population. So we're looking at one specific cohort, but it comes down to the regulator also saying that based on the evidence you have provided us in your consultation, this is a phase or how we will agree for you to conduct your study. They may or may not agree that if we say this could be a phase 3 study, they would say probably not. We're thinking this is more of a phase 2 study. So there is still a lot that needs to be determined. And this is, again, the difference between observational, real world evidence studies and controlled trials. So the controlled trial, we do have a lot more factors in place. And this is also lends to the thesis behind Knowde as well, like why we started the company. We'd rather bring a lot more scrutiny and control to the clinical trials to provide the regulators, but really the patients and their clinicians at the end of the day, the safety data that they require to make sound, prescribing practices and diagnosis and treatment options for their patients.
Yeah, I mean, that must be really exciting. You're kind of helping to write the rules as well. It's this relatively new area. And so actually, if we talk about the sort of the medical benefits of cannabis, where is there more research needed? And, where are some of the exciting areas that you're seeing and you're working on or you're aware of?
I would say practically, actually, going back a few steps is important. We still need more evidence about dosing and safety. That needs to still be addressed, as well as contraindications, so adverse interactions with other forms of medications. A lot more work has to be done in that space. Of course, we see a lot of work in pain is obviously the biggest area, anxiety, depression. But again, I think it can be focused far more and comparing it to existing studies. One thing that everybody has to and companies need to keep in mind is you can run a study, but your goal is to then get uptick from clinicians to actually prescribe it. So are you going to get a drug identification number? Or are you going to get the equivalent of that so that you can now prescribe it, have it covered by insurance, give it to your patient so they can go to the chemist and pick it up from, the pharmacist? But you still need to be able to prove to your medical authorities that it is good enough or better than the gold standard in that particular indication or in that particular sort of medical problem. So, am I going to go for a standard pain medication or am I going to go for cannabis? And do I have the evidence to show that it's better than, say, your prescribed analgesic, to that effect? So, we do need to be able to prove those things as well. So definitely the areas of pain are still a very big area. Sleep, cancer is coming up. We see that more and more often, but again, it could be the actual cancer cell that it's targeting, or it could be targeting the side effects of chemotherapy. Sabrina, anything to add?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of evidence with pain, but that's because meta-analysis was done, pulling together a lot of small studies. So we're definitely missing kind of large-scale trials. And also, some of the biggest reasons why physicians are not authorizing cannabis is because, we're all given the start low, go slow kind of thing, but they want more. They're uncomfortable, a lot of doctors, managing patients with cannabis because that whole dosing thing is, there's no definition of how to dose a patient. And so they're a little bit uncomfortable with that. And the biggest downfall of not having these clinical trials is there's still patients paying out of pocket, which even if it does help them, it's difficult for patients to have to pay for cannabis in Canada specifically. So, there's definitely a need for cannabis to kind of answer those questions about dosing and things like that.
So much to learn. Yeah. So, I mean, as we kind of come to the end, how are these sort of trials funded? And, are there any conflicts that kind of potentially can arise from that?
There's a lot of government funding, and I think that with countries that are just starting to look at legalization, I think that in some other countries, we're seeing that the government's going to probably want to put out funding there to have clinical trials to see if it works in different conditions and indications. I know here we have a lot of government funding that's not even being used, because although we have this government funding, we just don't have a lot of cannabis companies that have GMP products that have gone through preclinical testing. So it's kind of this situation where there's funding and it's not necessarily being used because we're lagging behind with cannabis companies having product ready for clinical trials. In terms of conflict, we did see kind of a pattern with cannabis companies buying clinics and those clinics running clinical trials. So there's definitely a conflict. It's like if Pfizer decided to, buy clinics and those clinics ran studies, those clinics are still Pfizer owned, right? So there is a conflict there. And we're starting to see that. I don't know if that's happening with other countries, but we're definitely seeing, a bit of conflict of interest there.
Yeah. And would it be the regulator who tries to sort of make that good?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that they're going to review the product and the protocol and things like that. But let's say that I was working for a clinic that was owned by a cannabis company. If we were doing a publication, then you'd have to communicate the conflict of interest there, right? So it does put in question the research work that you're doing. So just something to keep in mind that one of the things that we're doing with Knowde is, we look for partnerships in clinics where there's no conflict, where we can have, conduct objective research.
Yeah, very valuable. Jazz, have you got anything to add to that at the end?
Yeah, just maybe from how to pay for a study. So definitely government grants and incentives are important. But then if you are the study sponsor, you are ultimately responsible for not just paying for it, but from a regulatory standpoint as well. And that is something that we also try to convey to clients of ours in both cannabis and psychedelics, is that clinical research isn't anything new. There's no point in reinventing the wheel, but conducting the organization and the conduct of your clinical trial is important. And, obviously they are expensive. So knowing how much it's going to cost early on is important. And to Sabrina's point, identifying the right clinicians, the right sites to work with, so you're free of bias, because you would probably hate to go through 10 million pounds worth of clinical trials and then to have people rip your research apart because you used your product at your site on your patients with your physicians that you pay. So, it certainly introduces a lot of bias, and it's not the regulators who make that decision, to Sabrina's point, but it is at the end of the day, your peers. So as clinicians, it's your peers who review it to say, that's great data, but how do we know if it was very objective? And so what we try to do is come in early into companies and build their research roadmap for them that also indicates like where would be the best place, be it from friendly jurisdictions down to the sites that have the best ability to recruit for your study, but also lay out objectivity and ensure that conflicts are declared very early on to ensure that your data and your study is, full of integrity.
And one thing I just want to add with cannabis companies is a lot of times cannabis companies have board members, and a lot of times and I worked for a licensed producer, and a lot of times they want to see quick return on investment. And that's where, the quick investment is selling it on the rec and adult use side. But I mean, when you look at doing clinical trials, this is a long-term investment, right? And I think we just have to look at a company like GW Pharma to look at what that could be in terms of revenue. So it is definitely a good avenue for cannabis companies, but it is a longer term investment, definitely. And GW Pharma is the only one I could think of. They sold for $7.2 billion to Jazz Pharmaceuticals. So, that's more of the pharmaceutical path. And I'm surprised more cannabis companies are not going down that path. But I think we're kind of seeing that in some other countries, that they're starting to be more pharmaceutical driven, which is nice to see.
Yeah. Well, so you got to be in it for the long haul. And there's an element of self-regulation, I guess, in a way that your peers will recognize if if it looks biased. So it's in your own interest to try and strive for objectivity from the beginning. Cool. Okay, guys, look, this is such a massive topic. We could talk about it for ages, but I do need to draw it to an end. So I'd like to say massive thanks to both of you for joining me today. It's really interesting and great work that you're doing. So I wish you all the best with that and would love to have you back on the show at some point.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anuj. We're really looking forward to connecting again soon.
Pleasure. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I work with various cannabis startups to help them get funded and grow. I also work with corporates and international cannabis companies to help them understand and navigate the European cannabis sector. We're working with some great clients across the cannabis value chain, and we'd love to help you too. If you're interested, please visit www.canverse.global to get in touch.